Her body of work demonstrates that linguistic and cultural diversity is a strength to be reinforced, not a weakness to be eliminated. At a national level, her work continues to tread the line that our own esteemed late Professor Neville Alexander had paved about the value of multilingualism in primary education. At a continental level, her work puts into practice the ideological contours of Ngugi wa Thiong'o's classic work, Decolonizing the Mind, by putting meaning to the famous words of language as the carrier of culture. At a transcontinental level, her work is rooted in institutional pedagogy approach, most famed through Paulo Freire's magnum opus, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, where we understand that children do not walk into classrooms as empty vessels, but already possess knowledge that is to be engaged and enhanced by equally situated teachers. Still, at a transcontinental level, perhaps selfishly from my field of psychology, Frantz Fanon's opening chapter in Black Skin, White Masks on language is foundational in sociolinguistics, and it appropriately places the primacy of language in navigating and upholding the worlds we navigate beyond syntax and lexicon. It is therefore a real honor for UCT to have Professor McKinney's work produced here as it continues this proud tradition of the Global South in very practical ways. Her work experiments with openings that take as opportunities that which is often taken as a problem. Vice-Chancellor, many of us in this room know only too well the painful experiences of Black pupils who are often prohibited or reprimanded for speaking their languages in some schools in a democratic South Africa, no less. The mental injury of this prohibition is based on the historic demonization of African languages, sadly in an African country that prides itself of its diversity, which is underrepresented in its educational policy framework. To transcend this fault line and to move further to changing policy for effective integration of our cultural heritage, we need to listen very seriously to scholars like Professor McKinney. The profound impact of Professor McKinney's work is not only on the children that are the core focus of her work, but also on the teachers who are being taught how to teach in an arena that truly embraces bilingualism, multilingualism, and as I've learned through their work, translanguaging. As the institution that is rightfully known to have dared Rhodes to fall, sadly, he continues to loom large in our educational language practices, and the work of Professor McKinney is not only important for schools, but for us in higher education as well. Of course, as Professor McKinney knows, and as Neville Alexander constantly taught us, it all starts from primary education. We are therefore pleased to have this inaugural lecture by such an important scholar on such an important subject, for such an important demographic, our children, our future. It is also fitting that this lecture is hosted here in a building named after Neville Alexander. We acknowledge that his spirit lives on and that he would surely be extremely proud of Professor McKinney's work. So Carolyn McKinney is Professor of Language Education in the School of Education and Stream Leader for Applied Language and Literacy Studies. Her research and teaching focus on language and education policy, language and literacy ideologies, and the use of languaging for learning in multilingual education contexts of the Global South. She has led a number of ethnographic-style school-based research projects in these areas. Carolyn's publications include the book entitled Language and Power in Post-Colonial Schooling, Ideologies in Practice, which was published in 2017 by Routledge, and Decoloniality, Language and Literacy, Conversations with Teacher Educators, published in 2022 and co-edited with Pam Christie. She is lead editor of the second edition of the Routledge Handbook of Multilingualism, and a founding member of the Bua Lit Language and Literacy Collective, advocating for the use of African languages and multilingualism in education. So on behalf of the Faculty of Humanities, I would like to congratulate you, Carolyn, and all your achievements, which make us very proud. And please join me in giving Professor McKinney a very warm welcome. The stage is yours.
Thank you. I think the first thing I have to do is get some of this clothing off, because I'm not sure if it's middle age or, or what, but it's hot. Back in the wingsuit. Okay, here we go. Molweni nonke. Ndiyanibulela nonke ngokuza kwenu. Goeienaand and welcome. Thank you everybody for coming. VC, I've lost, Moshabela, Dean, Kathy, my family, my friends, students, and a greater community. I really appreciate that you're here this evening. Also, I would want to say my dear colleagues and students who've all helped me get to this particular moment. It's not an individual moment, it's a team. As you've seen, I'm going to talk about language and exclusion tonight. And there's a warning that it's a difficult topic. It's an uncomfortable topic. How's that? Okay. So, as I was saying, it's a difficult topic. It's an uncomfortable topic because it forces us to face racialized inequality. But it's also a story of inequality that we can change going forward. So this isn't a hopeless story. I think it's a hopeful story, but it takes the responsibility of all of us. So for some, I would say that research, activism, and advocacy should be kept very separate. As you've already heard, that for me, that's not the case. They are deeply intertwined. They feed into each other. And I think that it's really the research that drives the advocacy for the education system to be better for our children. So I'm going to share with you from three different research projects that have been conducted over the last 20 years in very different spaces, from typical under-resourced, no-fee schools to elite fee-charging schools that are very well-resourced, even over-resourced. And also in informal learning spaces, literacy clubs outside of the formal schooling domain. Now, I want to start, many people have seen this film, this documentary. I'm just going to show you 2 minutes of it, and I'll encourage those of you who haven't seen it to watch the full documentary on YouTube.
In what way are animals useful to people? Mascole?
Dog.
In what way are animals useful to people?
Dog help us to thieves. Cow to get milk. We get French in pig.
Yes, we get ham which is made of bacon, pig meat.
Zikhululekile. Amanzi.
Molecules zikhululekile. Good. Ophuma ntoni ke ngoku? Ophuma ntoni?
I don't know.
Tell us, where do we get water? Now, where do we get water? Yes? Yeah, imagine. What do you call imagine in English now? Yes? Where do we get? Let us change. Let us try to speak English, please. Where do we get water? Repeat the same thing. Yes? Yes? All right. Yes, Lord.
Acacise ukuthi kwenzeke ntoni?
Hi.
Do you think you could get AIDS by playing and talking to that child during interval?
You can only get AIDS if your blood and his blood goes against each other, like flows through.
The domestic animals, why are they tame?
It's because I feel like Latin.
Try it. Say it again.
It's because it don't want to stay.
They don't want to stay where? Latin in English is forest, ne? They don't want to stay in forest.
Phayana besenza ntoni? Ufuna ubhale. Bhala.
Then air bubbles came out. Why there were air bubbles? What does that show?
Swimming.
Swimming. Show swimming.
We speak about learner-centered education in South Africa, for example, and yet we insist on teaching children in a language they don't understand. If it's learner-centered, you'd expect that the language of the child is the point of departure. Instead, it's the language not even of the teacher, because most of the teachers are not even first language speakers of English. It's a foreign language.
In black and white, it is written in Constitution that all the languages are equal. That is written, but practically it's not been done like that.
Okay, so what is the current language and education policy and the practice in South African schools? Well, we have a policy that was produced in 1997, and you saw on my title slides there was a picture with the late Prof Neville Alexander at the Vulindlela Reading Club with children. And Prof Alexander was instrumental in igniting my thinking about multilingualism in education, and also in developing the amazing language policy that we have in the country, which actually promotes multilingualism and enables any one of the 11, then now 12, official languages to be the language of learning and teaching, as well as to enable multiple, so bilingual lot, like we have for Afrikaans and English, where you have dual medium schools and English and Afrikaans are used together in the same class, and those children then can write assessments in Afrikaans and have textbooks in Afrikaans or in English and matric exams as well. So it enables bilingual lot in any languages that are the official languages of South Africa. But what happens in practice is that for almost all our schools, they offer grade 1, 2, and 3 in an African language, which is the home language of the child in best cases. And then they do a sudden switch to English, language of learning and teaching, from grade 4 onwards. So that means that from grade 4, there are no learning materials and assessments in African languages at all. Every single thing that the child engages with from the beginning of grade 4 is in English. So everything on the posters, every textbook, every assessment, everything that they have to write. And that is after learning 2 to 3 hours of English as an additional language in grade 1, 2, and 3, if things go well and the curriculum time is actually used in that way. And I must just mention though, there's been a fantastic pilot of bilingual education with isiXhosa and Sesotho and English in the Eastern Cape, and that's the only exception that we have to this. So what happens in our classrooms is that orally, in the talk, the discourse is bi and multilingual, because teachers have got a sea of faces in front of them of children that don't understand them, and they need to be able to make meaning with those children. So what they do is they move between the children's familiar languages and English, the language of learning and teaching. But when it comes to the written activities, those are all in monolingual English. So the children's writing in their books has to be in English, their answering of tests, their test papers, and the textbooks. And then what happens is that these emergent bilingual students who are becoming bilingual are positioned as deficient monolinguals, because their isiXhosa or their isiZulu or their Setswana is no longer a resource that they are allowed to use in any of their subject areas except when they do that language as a subject. They are now seen as deficient monolinguals, not good enough in one language. Whatever other resources they have don't count. And they will write the same assessments as English first language students. So in the case of, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay. So in the first research projects that I'm going to share some data with you from, and I didn't say at the beginning that my research is qualitative and ethnographic style, which means it's very slow and it's very small scale, doesn't produce big numbers and big results. But what it tries to do is to understand in a detailed way what the experience is like for people in the research site. So for children and for teachers in that site, what is it like for them to experience every day and in whatever it is. So in the first example that I'm going to give you about what does it look like was from a project where we wanted to see at the beginning of grade 4 what is the experience for children in their classrooms like natural science, social science, and technology. We had been into the school at grade 3 towards the end of grade 3, which we're not really supposed to do, so I'm kind of not sure whether I should say that or not, but we wanted to know towards the end of the year, you know, how much English are the children actually being exposed to? And my colleagues, Robin Tyler and Kolisa Guzula and Babalwa Molati at the back also helped with organizing that data, found that actually there were no English classes happening in the grade 3. In fact, the only English class that they observed was one where they actually asked the teacher, are you going to be doing English? And the teacher, they talked about it and complained, why are you making us prepare an English lesson? And so there's 2 points about that. The one is the thing that even though there's supposedly 2 to 3 hours of English a week, there may not be any English in the week in the year before. Why? Because the standardized assessments are in home language and the tests drive the teaching. If the children are being tested in the home language, that's what those teachers are accountable for. That's what they are on the line for. And so that's what they prepare the children for. And then coming into grade 4. So at this moment of coming into grade 4 in this school in Khayelitsha, where we sat for 2 days a week in classrooms, at the very same time, my child, Luca, who's here, my oldest, he was in grade 4 in a very privileged suburban leafy school in the suburbs. And so that's another point that I want to make, is about how the personal comes together in the research process, because I can say it was excruciating for me to sit in those classrooms with these children, the same age as my child, following the same curriculum. And I'd come home and there was my child who'd had his 10 years of immersion in English, a full world in English, with the exact same textbooks as these kids that were really struggling. And that kind of a dissonance helps you to see something in a different way, maybe. It amplifies things, I would say. So what did a little glimpse of what it looked like. Okay, here is a grade 4 natural science lesson, and the teacher, who you can see, he's writing notes on the board with the textbook. You can just see it in his hand. He has taught the children about one of the foundational concepts, living and non-living things, and he has now, from the textbook, he's summarizing and making notes on the board, which the children then need to write into their own workbooks. So I'll just go a little bit closer so that you can see some of the details. So if I move the mouse, no, you can't see it when I move the mouse. Okay, I haven't got a pointer. But really what I want you to see is the first line. We share the world with many different living and non-living things. And then maybe just to see this, surroundings is hyphenated after the D, and he's of waste because he's written it fast. You can't really see the neat finishings of the F, right? So you could see it as all waste. So because there had already been quite a lot of work on oral, what was going on orally, we wanted to see what's going on in the children's workbooks. And so this is what I'm going to show you next. So I talked about what was happening for the children's books as transcription. When we do transcription from audio data, you write down exactly as you hear, right? And so this is really what was going on in the children's books. If you look at it quickly, it looks as though it's making sense. But then when you look closely, then you will see there's the withy, there's the non-living, there's the thingy, and then there is the whoops. Interesting, the surroundings, all of the children wrote surroundings exactly the same way with that hyphenation there as it was on the board. So they were actually transcribing a visual image rather than understanding the word. And that's why it also took them very, very long. Some children we would see writing letter by letter, looking up, looking down in transcribing. And you can see the all waste is there too. A very poignant example, you can't see it so nicely here, was this child who wrote, "We shake the word." I just thought you can't actually put it better. That's exactly what's going on. These children are shaking the words. And then you can have, and you might, an example where there's actually quite a good representation of text. Where there are not so many errors, right? Neat handwriting, you can look and think, oh, but this child's okay. But when we start to look at the little exercise that they have to do, under living things, the child has got bicycle and car in there, and under non-living things, there's a pair, okay? So there is a conceptual misunderstanding here that there's not a solid understanding of what the living and the non-living things are, even though the book itself is looking lovely from teacher's perspective. And then perhaps the most disturbing, it's beautiful and disturbing at the same time. An artifact that we came across was a child who had produced this little book, and he had very carefully folded and torn the edges so that, because without scissors, so that he could actually make a book. It's several pages. And when I took a photograph of it, actually didn't really get a chance to pick it up and look at it in detail. So looking at the photographs of it later, I realized, okay, so there are a lot of conventions here that this child has learned. You sign things like the teacher does. You date them. There's a date. You start with a capital letter at the beginning of the line. But there is no languaging here. This is just the text where the child is writing by basically simulating writing. It's aesthetic writing. So you kind of see where writing is now a process of folding, drawing, rather than meaning making. When you are exposed to texts that don't make sense to you, that's what they look like. That's what they can be, and that's what writing can become. Okay, I'm moving now to a very different context. I think that some might recognize this is not now, this is from the 2016 Sanssouci Girls High protests and the Pretoria Girls High protests. Of course, at the moment, there's more incidents at Pretoria Girls High and elsewhere. And on the side where you can see there's the child, they call them their pass books, these merit books where you are recorded positive merits or demerits. And the one that I've highlighted in yellow, you'll see there it's a demerit for not English in brackets talk. Okay, so in 2016, when this picture was taken, this child, the school rules basically didn't allow the use of languages other than English and noticeably Afrikaans. There's never a complaint, even at Pretoria Girls, about Afrikaans being used. But it's so not English here doesn't mean Afrikaans. Okay, it means an African language. So another dear colleague of mine who's online, Professor Pinky Makwe, we did a project in for schools, suburban, historically white schools that had desegregated, and for 3 of them, they were majority, in fact, almost all black in their learners and hardly white learners in the school. And this is, 20 years ago. And we were interested in those schools in how language was being used as a form of inclusion or exclusion. We didn't know before we went in, but also how with people describing those schools as white spaces, how were they still being white spaces even though all the kids, all the learners were black? And what we found is that the way that people spoke about language, the beliefs about language, so the language ideologies, were very, very powerful in creating a sense of exclusion and a lack of belonging in those school spaces. So I'm just going to show you some examples of the language ideologies in these spaces. Okay, so this first one is an interview with the grade 10 English teacher and also head of languages. And she says that, to me, in an academic class, the brighter girls usually do speak English to each other and lapse into their language less. So I'm just assuming that if you do well academically, your English is of a higher standard. I'm making that assumption. It can be just an assumption. In a weaker class, they'll speak vernacular more often. And in this school, when the grade 8s came in, they wrote an English proficiency test and a maths test, and they were streamed into the top to the bottom class based on the results of those tests. And the principal said that if you're not sure, go on the English marks. So the English proficiency that they came in with in grade 8 determined what level of class they were going to be in right through their schooling to grade 12. Then in an interview that Pinky and I did at the primary school where she was doing her main research, I happened to be there with this interview. The deputy principal, Mr. Mate, was an African language speaker himself, was answering a question about why do parents send their children to this school. And he said, I want to believe the school offers a high standard of education and so on. The third reason is a greater percentage of African kids here. I think people in the area will feel more comfortable to send their kids to a place where there are more African kids, especially if you look at kids who come from rural areas who have basically no language. So this is another discourse of languagelessness that we call, where if you don't have an English language resource, you have no language. Even though by the time children come to school and they're 5 and 6 years old, unless they have a developmental problem, they are fully proficient and richly proficient in language, their language from home. I did say about, uncomfortable, so this is even more. This is an English teacher in Cape Town. He's talking about the English of her students. Now, I must say that this is an elite school, and the kids were all highly fluent in English. So they might be multilingual and bilingual, but they could perform as monolingual English speakers, which is what they did all day at school. And she says, the black children have come up through the formerly white schools, meaning the primary schools, and they've been taught by English-speaking people. So when they went in, their English, in fact, was pure and untainted because it didn't exist. So when they learned English, they learned it from English speakers. But the English-speaking colored children that their home language was not taught by, they were taught by people who were speaking the Cape Flats. And as a result, they struggle with English. I mean, you may have noticed in the class, some of those little black girls, when they speak, they are fluent and they speak beautifully. And their accents are so frightfully standard English. And the colored children can't do that. So apart from the patronizing little black girls, I mean, the clear racism that's going on with her judgment of the accents there was one of the children she's calling the colored children who loved to read in the Shakespeare. She'd always put her hand up to read, which was fantastic. And the teacher said to me after, this was like, I don't know why she always wants to read, with that accent. Yeah. Okay. So I've shown you two, I think, very clear but quite different examples of language and exclusion, how it's used for exclusion, and how it follows the fault lines of race. It is not white middle-class English speakers that are being excluded. Okay, it's African language speakers. It's people who are not speaking with a white South African English accent that is the one that is most privileged in these kinds of environments. So I'm moving on now to why. If I say to you that Sink or Swim film was made 20 years ago, and we have a policy that actually enables African languages to be in the classroom, to be in the textbooks, to be in the universities, why? So I'll just spend a little bit of time explaining the way that I have explained and theorized this. Okay. I think that what we call monolingual myths are very, very powerful, and these shape people's thinking about language. So the first one of these is the idea that languages are pure, that they are autonomous. In other words, English starts here and it ends here. Afrikaans starts here and it ends here, and there's no crossover between them. Is Ja English or is it Afrikaans? Okay, language is more fuzzy in the real use, but on people's minds, languages are pure and bounded. Okay, but it's a social construct. The other myth is that monolingualism, or a high level of proficiency in a single named language, is the norm. One language, one nation. It was part of the European nation building kind of project, this idea that a country has one language. And the idea that linguistic purity, that speaking only one language at a time, is inherently superior. Mixing languages is deficient. Finally, the idea that bi or multilingualism is somehow undesirable. Now we have to think about this. If we think, who are the most monolingual speakers in the world? It's English speakers. English speakers are the most monolingual. And this is really quite an irony that somehow English speakers have managed to turn their own linguistic deficit into something that is seen as superior. How do you do that? But very successfully, so you turn your deficit, your limitations, into something superior, so that then the richness and that others have and that you don't have, well, it doesn't matter anyway. I don't have it, but it doesn't matter anyway, right? And so, this is really part of the problem. I'll talk about Anglo-normativity in a minute, but I want to talk about the last point first. In my field of applied linguistics, it's this idea about who makes the knowledge, and that counts. In North America, which has been dominant in the field of applied linguistics, the researchers themselves were predominantly monolingual English speakers, studying their own infants and their own students, right? So the field of first language acquisition and second language acquisition developed as if this described children all over the world. In fact, most children actually grow up with more than one language, bilingually or multilingually in their environments. And so the ethnocentrism of the people who make the science actually makes bad science. It's not to say that we don't need to understand how children who grow up monolingually learn language. We do need understandings of first language acquisition, and children who learn later in life a second language. We need to understand that. But what we don't need is to pretend that that's actually how all the children, typical children, develop, because that is not the case. So when we want to understand what do they mean when they say decolonize education, decolonize curriculum, that's what people are talking about, that there's actually knowledge that is partial and that doesn't serve us well because it's not including our whole world population. Okay, so going back to Anglo-normativity, this is it's a name for a language ideology that I developed to try to explain how normative the expectation that everybody should just speak English and know English is. So it draws on the idea of heteronormativity, which expects that heterosexuality is the norm. Everybody should be in male-female couples, and if they aren't, then they're deficient, there's something wrong with them. It's the same idea with Anglo-normativity, that somehow if you don't speak English proficiently, there's something wrong with you. Okay. And that's a monolingual belief that normalizes and turns an abnormal into a normal. So the next step then, where does this come from? Monolingual myths is, as I've already been hinting at, is the idea of coloniality, which, as Maldonado Torres explains, differs from colonialism. Colonialism is the political period which has come to an end. But coloniality is about what remains of that afterwards, what survives from colonialism. So as he says, it refers to the long-standing patterns of power that emerged as a result of colonialism, but that define culture, labor, intersubjective relations, and knowledge production well beyond the strict limits of colonial administration. And in his last sentence, in a way, as modern subjects, we breathe coloniality all the time and every day. Forcing children to be English monolinguals is one of the ways in which they are forced to breathe coloniality. And then, as I've already explained, coloniality also points out the myth of the universality of Western knowledge, as if knowledge that's made in one part of the world applies to everybody, rather than acknowledging that there is ethnocentrism in that, and we need to look at who makes the knowledge and how does that influence what is being made. So we argue for what's, instead of a universe, pluriversality, which says multiple ways of knowing and being. We can't throw out the first language acquisition. It does actually apply to some children. We need it, but we also need the other kinds of theorizing from the global south and from excluded and marginalized populations. So as Dean Chose already mentioned, doesn't want to go forward. Or maybe it says I must stop. There is the idea of the coloniality of language has been named. And what it's basically referring to is, just as we know that in colonization, colonized peoples were reduced to subhuman, inferior animal-like beings. And by association, their languages were also viewed in that way. And that's something that continues into the present. So in 1986 already, Ngugi wa Thiong'o wrote about the effects of language. He says, in my view, language was the most important vehicle through which that colonial power fascinated and held the soul prisoner. The bullet was the means of the physical subjugation. language was the means of the spiritual subjugation. And that is why he argues for decolonizing the mind. So I'm not going to talk through this because of time, but just to show you that Ngugi writes about his experiences of being humiliated for using Gikuyu in his primary school. His son, Mukoma, who is my age, Mukoma wa Ngugi, on the other side, writes about the same experience that he had at primary school. And then he goes back to his primary school in 2017, and he writes about how the rule that you should not speak vernacular, it's prohibited, is still on the classroom door, right? So this is not something, this is exactly what is meant by coloniality is what survives colonialism, because that political system might be over, but the effects are still playing out. Just to give one, I think, further example of this. So apart from being a scholar and a professor, Ngugi is a novelist as well, and so is his son. And his son made the argument in this book, The Rise of the African Novel, that in fact, African literature is seen to have started from the Makerere Conference in 1962. But those novels and the novelists that were invited there were all people who were writing in English. And so he talks about this huge gap that actually African literature in written form started long before that. What about, he says, the South African novels that were produced in the 1880s to the 1940s, written in isiZulu, isiXhosa, and Sesotho? Those were just excluded. So he says there's a hole in what people are actually thinking about as African literature. And his father at the time said, well, they didn't think about African languages in literature. It just wasn't even on the radar. So what this, I think, is really important for us to acknowledge is that the depth of the beliefs that African languages don't belong in education are seen through not just what people say, but also about what scholars of African literature themselves have actually included and excluded as African literature. And it's led to a perceived illegitimacy of African languages in the written form, that African languages can't be written. What colleagues of mine and here we've talked about is the text frontier, that actually when people see a textbook written in African language, they're shocked and they don't want to use it because shouldn't be. How can this be? Okay. But the children that we have, our children, are creative meaning makers, and they are linguistically resourceful, and so are our teachers. And so I'm going to just show a few examples of hopeful practice to coming to the end. So the first example that I'm showing is from a project which I think all the researchers that are here, the Languaging for Learning project. And this particular example is from a paper Suraya Abdulatif and Polisa Gazula have got coming out. And in this project, the teachers were supported to, despite the fact that they have English LOLs, to work bilingually in isiXhosa and English. And this is an example from a science class where the children have produced these newsprint notes and they are explaining them to the rest of the class using both isiXhosa and English. So one little moment. Another little moment, I'm not going to be able to talk through it all, but a wonderful literacy holiday camp that was run by the Nelson Mandela Institute for Rural Education, University of Fort Hare, and Polly was working there at the time. And in this environment, the children worked with all their language resources in a fluid way. So there's no restriction on what language you use when. Both isiXhosa and English were used in the written materials, in the oral explanations. Some of the poems and stories that were told were in English, some were in isiXhosa. There was play, there was performance, and there was joint writing, and there was individual writing. And I'll just give you, or you can't really see the thing, but you'll see that the facilitators would write down what the children said in the language it came. So the first line is umtu angabin and cloni, okay? Don't be shy, but then you'll see middle, respect each other. So whichever language the children are comfortable in sharing, that's what the facilitator records on the newsprint in the shared writing. But, you know, that doesn't mean then that the children are not able to write monolingually, because they produce this lovely journal where the children write individual pieces, and they can choose to submit in English and in isiXhosa. So here's this one little girl that Polly and I had in the group, Usipile, who was the smallest, the youngest, and the most prolific in her writing. Okay. So what should happen? What does this mean? Well, I think that in schools which begin with African language of learning and teaching and switch to English from grade 4, what should happen is that children should be able to continue with that home language that they have from grade 1 to 3, and English should be added to that so that they have 2 languages and they are starting to increase their proficiency in English until they are more comfortable to write in it, to read in it, and so on. So that is what we call mother tongue-based bilingual education, where you start with a base of your most familiar language, and then you add in English gradually, and having 2 languages of learning and teaching. What about the elite private and semi-private schools? Those are our Model C, ex-Model Cs, I call semi-private because they are, where English is the LOLTA from grade 1. Well, in those schools, first of all, we should be finding out, teachers should be finding out what are the language resources of the children in their classroom. What languages are there in the room? And then how can we bring those in and affirm those? How can those children share those language resources with others? How can we bring them into our classroom? Also, and something I'm very passionate about, is we need to, in those primary schools, as well as secondary, be offering African languages at least at first additional language level. Because at the moment, there are very few primary schools that do that. And that means that when kids get to high school, they actually can't take first additional language African languages because they haven't had it from grade 1 to grade 7. It also means that primary schools can say, oh, well, we need to hire English and Afrikaans fluent speakers, so we're not going to hire African teachers, except for teaching isiXhosa conversation once a week. So it's also a way of actually not transforming the staff complements of those schools. And then in the elite historically white universities like UCT, I mean, we have such a wealth and richness among the staff and among the students of languages in our environment. And really, we need not to be an Anglo-normative space, but we need to be a space where in the lecture hall, in the seminars, people's language resources are used. We need to be experimenting with teaching bilingually. Suraya and I have been doing that in the PGCE, which has been quite interesting. And we need to be moving towards having African languages much more prominently in our teaching and in our research and in our environment. So I won't do the plug on the Boelitz pamphlets which explain mother tongue and what have you. I will just read a poem and end. This poem was written quite some time ago by a boy when he was in high school in Soweto, and it was a project in the English class with his teacher, Robert Mangedzo. He says, it's called The Song of Me. I am discriminated against and underestimated. My tongue has made me a stranger. My tongue has created enemies for me. Though I've been born to be a king, my tongue has made me a slave. On the television program, news is available. Izindaba is available. Ditaba is available. Where is Timhaka? On the electrical plant, notice is dangerous. Notice is Khafar. Notice is Ngozi. Where is the notice for Kombo? South African news is about the West. Where is my Limpopo province situated? The rejected stone turns out to be the chief stone. the broken Sangami, the rejected Sangami, the despised Sangami, the wounded Sangami. I will rise with the power of Chris Hani. If racism is the race that I must run, I'm determined and devoted to run the race. I think that what's so powerful about Sanboy Makubela's poem is not only that he expresses the pain of exclusion, language and exclusion, but also that he makes the meaning so powerfully through multilingualism. Without the words in isiZulu, in Setsonga, it actually can't communicate the way that it can multilingually. Multilingualism is more powerful in communicating than monolingualism. All my dear special Boerlit colleagues, as well as my mentor, Professor Pam Christie, that I want to acknowledge. There are lots of people I want to acknowledge, but I can't. So thank you everybody very much for listening.
What should happen next, you ask? I think therapy is a necessary part. I'm so triggered, I need therapy. I don't know about you. So if I don't tell you this anecdote, I'm never going to tell you. So let me tell you. Don't tell anyone. When I was in matric and I was being taught English, it was taught in isiPedi. I was taught English in isiPedi. So the teacher would read in English, we stop listening and we're looking at each other, then translate into isiPedi, then we start listening. And then she would read something which is a joke, and maybe a couple of people would laugh and would look at each other. Only when he translates, then we start laughing. When I went to varsity to do first year of medicine, I couldn't express myself in English. In Durban. And they also spoke isiZulu. So I had to learn isiZulu as well, so that I can get around the city. Because English has a problem, isiZulu has a problem. So listening to your presentation about the power of multilingualism is something that we all understand deeply for those of us who have gone through those experiences, but we can't really articulate. That's why you find people frustrated, but not really able to express what you have just shared with us. So thank you. Can we give her another round? So without taking too much of your time, let me invite Dr. Xolisa Kuzula to come and give us a vote of thanks. Over to you.
No, it's fine.
Mulweni, ninjani? Diniwe. But also inspired by the talk that Professor McKinney has just given. Thank you very much, Professor Mashabela, for giving me the platform to give these few words about the work that Professor McKinney has done. But I would like to start by talking about how I met her. So I met Professor McKinney in 2009, towards the end of 2009. Apparently, she had arrived at UCT in that year, and I didn't know about it because although I was working in education under Professor Dr. Neville Alexander, we were in separate buildings. And I didn't know in the School of Education that there was someone like her. So by that time, when I met her, I was ready to throw in the towel on my master's degree, which I had studied for many years. I'm even embarrassed to give you the number of years. I was supposed to write that thesis. I had finished coursework in 1 year while working, but writing that thesis was something that was difficult for me. First of all, so I want to say I was introduced to Professor McKinney by Dr. Heather Jacqueline, who was my second employer when I had finished at university. And at this university, she employed me to be a researcher with her, together with Professor Ashla Hodley. And I had done research for 2 years, but I was struggling to write this thesis that I needed to write. And Dr. Heather Jacqueline was my supervisor also, not just a co-worker, but also a supervisor. But I was just not ready to write that thesis because it wasn't something that I was passionate about. So then she suggested someone else who was at the department. And that supervisor didn't understand what I was trying to do. She thought I was trying to investigate how to teach second language learners to teach them better in English. And I wasn't looking for that. And I was like, no, I want to research bilingual education and multilingual education. So how to teach multilingual learners, not to teach second language learners, second language speakers of English, how to learn in English better. So that's where the misunderstanding was. And then I just gave up the thesis. I had 2 kids. I was like, okay, let me raise my kids. But I kept on registering each year. Yeah, I registered and then did nothing for the whole year. Register again, did nothing the whole year. So come 2009, Dr. Heather Jacqueline meets with me at Montebello, and she says, I think there's somebody that you need to meet. She is in our department. She has just come from vets, and I think she has a similar orientation to language and learning as the one that you have. And so I met Professor McKinney, and in 2010, I registered for my master's again. And I was working full-time. I had 2 young children. My last born was 7 years at that time. But I finished that thesis because I said to her, I'm going to America in January, you know. I need to finish this thesis quickly. So, and she said, you need to sit on your bum and you need to write that thesis. So that's how I met Carolyn. At the time, I felt that she did not only understand what I was trying to do, but she also understood how to work with a multilingual or a bilingual like myself, without making me feel that I was inadequate in the way that I was writing in English, without actually, most of the time, she pointed out that I could write better. She was like, you don't need an editor for your thesis. Your thesis is right as it is. As a result, I didn't send my thesis to an editor. And I was shocked. How can it be that I can write a thesis without, you know, taking it to an editor? So that made me feel so competent. So there are many ways in which we can work with multilinguals that people need to understand. So now, after finishing the master's, Dr. McKinney started mumbling something about the PhD. And I said to her, well, I do not want to be an academic. Academics are living in their own heads and they don't solve problems that we have in society. I'm right as I am because I train teachers. I go to schools every day and I see what's happening in school every day, and I don't want to be living in the ivory tower. And so I was that stubborn. So by 2012, by 2013, I left Cape Town and to work in the rural areas of Mqanduli, Qunu, and Bizana for the Nelson Mandela Institute for Education and Rural Development. I left her and I was like, I'm not coming to PhD. Not everybody needs a PhD. So, but she didn't give up on me. She came back and said, can we collaborate on a research project? And by that time, I was doing the Pemba Mfundi writing camps that she showed. And we were working bilingually with the students of Forte, who were also doing social work, not necessarily education, social work and other degrees, but they were creative writers. And we inspired those grade 4, 5, and 6 learners to write creatively and to produce and to print written material. And we wanted to research, therefore, how is it that though we were using 2 languages, the children could still publish their book, their writings monolingually in English and isiXhosa, contrary to what people say when they think of multilinguals as semilingual. You're not good in Xhosa, you're not good in English, you are mixing your languages. But the children were doing both, and the facilitators were doing both, but the children were able to write in both languages. So before I knew it, I found myself coming back to UCT in 2015 to study my PhD, and I could only do it under her because she was the only person to me who understood the work that I was trying to do. So without belaboring the points, I want to talk a little bit about her contribution to society, how the work she does contributes to society. First of all, this work, in doing this work, Professor McKinney is resisting coloniality in education. A lot of times, decolonial scholars talk about coloniality of knowledge, coloniality of being, coloniality of power, and they leave out coloniality of language. And this is how she extends those notions of coloniality that Quijano wrote about. She does this by fighting colonial language ideologies such as what we call, Robin and I, called colonial normativity, which she hadn't spoken about, because the work is far-reaching, not only in South Africa, but she's had students in Namibia and elsewhere who come and study here. So we talk about colonial normativity as the expectation that everybody must speak the colonial language of their country. So in some countries it's Portuguese, in some countries it is French, in South Africa it is English, and this is where the Anglo-normativity comes in. She fights that kind of ideology. She also does this work by fighting, she fights racial-linguistic ideologies. We heard Professor McKinney talking about race and language and how those are interconnected and how we judge people based on race and also their accents. She fights that in education. And she also aims to bring about epistemic justice and epistemic access to education of Black African language-speaking children. How does she do this work, though? I think the part of the work that she hasn't mentioned when she was presenting to us is her social justice work, her activist work that she engages in. because it is not only by teaching in classrooms like this and also writing in journals that you can change society. You have to be on the ground with the people and help them. So Professor McKinney's work reaches communities through collaborative work that she does with others, together with her students, such as Dr. Robin Tyler here and Dr. Soraya Abdulatif, myself, Babalwa Yashemulade, right there standing at the end of the lecture theatre, as well as working with other students that are not here in the room, like Glynis Lloyd and senior colleagues such as Professor Pinky Makwe, Professor Kell. We founded the Bualit Language and Literacy Collective, and we use that as a vehicle for fighting for a socially just society. So in Bualit Language and Literacy Collective, Professor McKinney has been involved in co-authorship of op-eds that explain the language issues to the general public. Her most recent being the one that came out in Sunday Times last Sunday, and in talking about the work through radio interviews. She's involved in training publishers on how to think about designing multilingual materials, in co-authoring advocacy materials that explain multilingual education, that help provincial and national departments of education to imagine different models of bilingual education for their context and for helping schools to develop their school language policies. She does this through filming videos that help to spread the word about importance of multilingual education in meaning making and social justice. And through Bualit Language and Literacy Collective, Professor McKinney has helped schools in the southern suburbs to review their language policies in line with the Constitution and in line with the Language in Education Policy of 1997. I can safely say that these schools will not be affected by the Bella Bill should it be passed, because they are in line with the Constitution and they are in line also with the Language in Education Policy. She has trained their teachers and their SGBs and raised awareness about their discriminatory language ideologies. She has pushed back against literacy ideologies that narrow literacy down into just skills of decoding, and she fights for approaches that enrich literacy experiences of children and young people beyond just written literacies. She is working with the National Department of Basic Education, as she mentioned earlier, where we are now trying to figure out how to implement mother tongue-based bilingual education from 2025. Hopefully, if Minister Siviwe Kwahube takes this up, this is the work that is going to happen. So I would like to congratulate Professor McKinney on behalf of my colleagues in the School of Education and say halala. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for staying with us until this point. We are going to allow the platform party to exit, and we are going to stick around. We hope that we can have refreshments outside if they are still there. I saw a few people going out. And hopefully we can also hear your thoughts and your reflections on the lecture. Once again, congratulations, Professor McKinney.